Hey everybody, my name's Tim Rogers and I am an alcoholic. My sobriety date is April 16th, 2011. I obviously can't do this. My home group is their Solution Group. It's in Holly Springs, North Carolina. I do have a sponsor, and I do sponsor other men. I think that's everything. I've actually been a member. My sobriety date is 2011. I've been a member of Alcoholics Anonymous since 2002. I'll kind of get to that. I had a one-night relapse in 2011. Not to minimize it, it was just as bad as any other relapse. Being that that Marcy and I are here together, we kind of talked about it a little bit. More talked about. What I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of give my normal AA talk, very condensed, but more talk about a lot how Marcy was involved in my recovery mainly. So I think that's everything. My one drinking story that involves Marcy, and I'll just be real quick about this. I drank for 25 years. I always drank alcoholically. I was just thinking, sitting there, I remember this one time I opened the fridge on a Sunday night. I hadn't drank all day for some reason. And I knew the stores weren't open, and I opened the fridge and there were only 2 beers in there. And I closed the door. I didn't even bother drinking those 2 beers because they weren't going to get me where I needed to be. That's just the way I drank. If I drank, I was drinking to get drunk. And just like the book talks about, once I put alcohol in me, I needed more and more. And I knew there wasn't going to be more that night, so I just closed the door and went off to bed and was miserable the rest of the evening. The one story, like I said, I drank for 25 years. Somewhere towards the end there, this one Halloween, I got this really bright idea to scare my kids on Halloween. And I had been drinking all day. I had been drinking Seagrams all day and drinking beer, and it was dark. And I told Marcy, the kids had gone to another neighborhood to trick or treat, and I asked Marcy, when you pick them up, when you bring them back, bring them around the house, and I'm going to scare them. And while she was gone, my original plan was to jump off the deck and scare them, but while she was gone, I had to crank that up a little bit, so I climbed up on the roof of our house. And I was hiding behind our chimney, and she came up the walk with our 2 children. They were little, and I came flying off the roof, and my mask came up over my face, and I didn't know when I was going to hit the ground, and when I hit the ground, my knee slammed into my chin, and I bit through my tongue. And the kids were screaming, and I was laying there in a pool of blood. And Marcy just looked down at me, and she stepped over top of me and said, "I'm going to bed. You put the kids to bed." And that was it. And that's just kind of the way things went. And that was the beginning of the end of my drinking, which is always, I call it the worst years of my drinking. From that point forward, I tried to get myself sober for 2 years. And those were the worst 2 years of my life. I tried to get myself sober by myself. I really didn't know anything about Alcoholics Anonymous, didn't know anything about recovery, but I just started this cycle of, I knew that things were bad, and I knew that I needed to stop drinking, and I thought it was just something I could do myself. And my dad had always raised me kind of to solve my own problems, and it was no fault of his. He wasn't an alcoholic or anything, and it worked well for him. So I just thought that's what I needed to do, and I failed miserably at it. I would go for periods without drinking, and then, just like the book says, my brain would start playing tricks on me and convince me that it wasn't as bad as I thought, that jump off the roof really wasn't that bad, and that I could have a drink again. And then I would do it, and like we'd be going out on a Saturday night, and I'd say, "Well, I'm just going to drink tonight." And once I took that drink, I was off to the races again. And I did this cycle for an entire 2 years. And at the end, what happened was I didn't drink for a whole summer. I did some other things, but I didn't drink for a whole summer, and it was September, and something happened at work, and I got this bright idea that I solved a huge problem at work, and I thought I deserved a reward. And so on the way home, I said, I'm going to buy a pint of Seagrams. I'm going to take a couple hits. I'm going to throw that bottle away. And I'm just going to go back to not drinking again. And on that way home, I did all those things, but I didn't throw the bottle away. I took those couple hits. I went off to a high school football game. But I stuck that bottle under the front seat of my car. And when I got back home after the football game, I made sure everybody was off to bed, and I pulled that bottle out and I finished it. And that started from September till January of 2002. I did that almost every day. I waited till everybody went off to bed at night. At that time, Marcy was in nursing school, so she was going to bed early. And I'd wait till the house was quiet, and I'd go out and drink a bottle of Seagrams every night. And I'd stay up real late, and I'd get up and go to work every day the next day because I was trying to keep this facade up that everything was normal and that I wasn't drinking. And after whatever 8 months of that, I was just a mess in January. And I remember this one I woke up on a Sunday morning, and on weekends, Marcy was off working in a nursing home. She worked 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. So I'd get up Sunday morning, and I'd put a buzz on in the morning and pass out for a little bit, and then do it again in the evening. I got a double on Saturday and Sunday. And this particular Sunday, I had just had enough. I had lost a bunch of weight. I looked frail, and I was just sick and tired of being sick and tired. And I took a couple hits that morning, and I dumped everything out, and I went back and climbed back in bed. And sometime that Sunday night, I started throwing up, and it was just sick as a dog. And I honestly thought I had the flu. And I laid in bed for a couple of days, called out sick, and then somewhere between Sunday and Wednesday, it dawned on me that I didn't have the flu. I was going through the DTs, and I was having withdrawals from alcohol, and that's why I was sick. I was cold, I was hot, I was seeing things, all that stuff. And what happened is on Wednesday, I summoned Marcy home, and I always remember this story. She came home from nursing school, and I had my head down, and I was telling her this big, fifth step story of what I've been doing the last couple months. And Marcy's not a violent person at all. But what I was telling her was, I've been sneaking around on you for months and doing all these things behind your back, and I expected to feel a slap across the head. And when I looked up, Marcy smiled at me, and I was like, how can you be smiling after I told you all this? And she said, Tim, I've known for years that you were an alcoholic, but I knew that nothing was going to change until you admitted you were an alcoholic. And I was also very suicidal, so she told me to take my shoelaces out of my shoes, and we were off to Holly Hill. And I checked into Holly Hill and finished detoxing, and they suggested that I go to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. And so that I got out on a Saturday, and I went to the old Willis Springs group on a Sunday night. And I got there that night, and I met a bunch of people, and one of those people I met that night was a guy named Richard Page. I think a lot of you guys know him. He was a member of this group. And he had just gotten sober a couple months earlier. I met a bunch of people that night, and I don't remember a lot from that meeting, but I remember that line that was just read, that if you want what we have, and that's all I remember, if you want what we have. And in my short time at that meeting that night, I had decided that I wanted what you all had. I saw a bunch of people who were happy. They were somehow getting along without drinking. One thing I always remember is, like I said, I drank by myself a lot. And I remember I pulled into that meeting, and I looked down, and there were different groups of people standing in the parking lot, but I didn't see anybody off standing by myself. And I was always that guy off standing by myself. And I remember that from that night, and that gave me hope that, that I could be a part of y'all. And so I jumped right in. Jumped right into Alcoholics Anonymous. I listened to what people said. I got a sponsor. I came early. I set up. I started working the steps with that sponsor, and started doing everything. We read. My first sponsor was from New York, and he kind of did things a little different than how I do them and how my sponsor did them. So I went through the steps with him the way he had done them. Which was kind of, we would read the book a little bit, but then we would do some other things. And I stayed sober, and I got sober my first year. And at the end of that first year, I was doing a lot of different things. And he kind of said, Tim, I'm really good with newcomers, but you may want to move on to a different sponsor. And at that point, I ended up with Jerry W. And he took me back through the book, and we did the steps through the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, which is how I do it now with the men I sponsor. And I always consider that really fortunate, because I went through the steps twice within 18 months of joining Alcoholics Anonymous, and it was really beneficial to me. And so that happened. Some of the things, like I said, I wanted to incorporate Marcy into some of this. One of the things, Willow Springs group, Sunday nights they had 2 meetings. They had a beginner's meeting, and then they had a big book study. And then every Thursday they had a speaker meeting. And they were open meetings. And very much from the beginning, Marcy came to those open meetings with me. I'm not going to tell her story, but it gave her an understanding of what I was doing. And she heard a lot of different speakers, and it was very beneficial for me to have her with me as part of my recovery. We would go there every Thursday, and then we would go out to dinner afterwards and talk about what the speaker talked about, and talk about my sobriety. And my sobriety was very much a family affair. Everybody got involved. I have 2 children. We have 2 children. Over the years, my daughter ended up, she was 19 years old, and I was kind of oblivious. She was always this good kid. She was a cheerleader, seemed to be kind of like me. She was a little bit of a loner, and kind of just oblivious to what was going on with her, and came to realize that, all those nights she said she was staying over at Susie's Susie's house tonight. She was actually out partying and drinking just like I had done. And at some point, she went to Marcy and said, I think I have a problem with drinking. What do I do? And Marcy said, well, there's some guy down at the end of the hall that probably can help you. And I got to take Lauren to her very first AA meeting and watch her get a white chip and help her through her sobriety. And she's thrived in Alcoholics Anonymous. She was actually the chair of Nikki Pa last year for the whole Nikki Pa that took place in Wilmington. She lives down there now. And so it's very much been a family affair. Going to meetings with Lauren, Marcy coming to meetings. We pray together as a family anytime we're together. Prayer's been a huge part of my interactions with Marcy. Reading the big book, throughout the book, it talks a lot about family, and it talks about involving our family in our recovery, and I don't always see that a lot, and I try to, when I sponsor other men, I try to encourage them about that. And one of the spots in the book is when you get to the 11th step, and it talks about morning meditation. It says, we invite our spouse to join us in morning meditation. And I read that one night with a sponsee, and I thought, well, I've never asked that. And so I went home that night, and I said to Marcy, would you like to join me in my morning prayer? And she said, absolutely. And we started doing that. still do it every day. And, we do it straight out of the book. We kind of start with the prayer, and then we sit quiet and think about our day ahead, and we ask Creator to take away self-pity, self-seeking, dishonesty, and fear. And then we think about our day ahead, and then we wrap it up with a prayer with each other, and we go off. I go off to work, and Marcy's fortunate enough to work from home, and we go our separate ways and try to have a spiritual day. If I try to do those 4 things and not do those 4 things, not be selfish, not be self-seeking, not be fearful or dishonest, I know I have a really good day, and it's been a huge part of our recovery together. So I'm going along between 2002 and 2011. I'm sponsoring people. I went into Central Prison for a long time. You see Wallace there every week. I was doing everything that my sponsor suggested I do, and everything was going along very good. And the book has this thing called a lurking notion, and I started getting this lurking notion, and I want to respect, our singleness of purpose here, but I started getting this lurking notion that I could smoke a little something, and as long as I didn't take a drink and didn't tell anybody about it, it'd be okay. And I started having that recurring thing, and I actually mentioned it to my sponsor once. And probably minimized it a lot, or he would have shut it down a lot more. And that thought kept working on me, and so one night in 2011, I finally gave in to that lurking notion, and I didn't know where to get any, so I went to a tobacco store and bought some of that K2 stuff. This was a huge mistake. And essentially what happened is I overdosed on that and got really, really sick, and ended up having to call Marcy, who in turn called Jerry, my sponsor, and you want to talk about demoralization. I'm in the kitchen, just totally out of it, throwing up, and my sponsor comes through the front door, and I just remember looking up at him and it was awful. It was terrible. And like I said, I'd never minimize that one night relapse, but my one thought somewhere afterwards was that my higher power said, Tim, if you're going to give in to this lurking notion, we're going to get it over really quick. And it was over, and it was out. And so that was a Friday night. And on Sunday, I went right back to Willow Springs and got a white chip. And I went right back to being at Jerry's house at 7 o'clock in the morning once a week. And when he started reading the book, he started at the very beginning, and he was reading the copyright, and he was reading the table of contents. And I looked at him and I said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, I want to make sure we don't miss anything this time." And we read the whole book again, and I did the steps again. At the time I did that, I was sponsoring like 4 guys, and if you want to talk about another terrible thing to have to do, it's to have to call your sponsees and tell them that you relapse and that you can no longer sponsor them. That's just devastating. And I tell that story that it is humorous what I did, but I always, if you get anything out of my talk, is that if you have a lurking notion, talk to your sponsor about it or talk to somebody about it, and don't minimize it at all, and try to shut it down before anything happens. And just like everything else, that was just as devastating to Marcy as it was to me, and devastating to my daughter. She saw me that night too, and I always think it's funny, but she got sober when she's 19, and I'm 57, and she's been sober longer than me. But anyway, after that, like I said, I went through the steps again with Jerry, and I got right back got back right on the horse and started doing those things I do. Like I said, I still sponsor people today, and still do a lot of things with my home group. I've always had a service position, and so the story about praying with Marcy, that day that I relapsed, Marcy had been sick that week. And I didn't want to wake her up in the morning. And I didn't pray with her that day. That's another thing that was different that day, that we didn't pray together that day. And I don't know that that's what caused it, but I don't think that's what caused it. The lurking notion caused it. But it's always stuck in my head, and I try really hard to not miss that morning prayer with her anymore. So that's my half of the story. And what I'm going to do now is turn it over to Marcy, and I don't know what she's going to do, but we'll find out, right?
Okay. So my name is Marcy Rogers, and I am a blessed member of Al-Anon. My home group that I go to is the Easy Does It Al-Anon family group in Apex, North Carolina. If you're ever up visiting Jerry for the day, it's in his little area. And I will bring up Jerry in my story because Jerry's been a big part of my life too. So we meet on Tuesday nights from 7 to 8 o'clock. I have a sponsor who has a sponsor, and then I sponsor other women. I've been very, very blessed to be in my home group. So this is very different for me to be on this side of things because I usually am out in the audience listening to an AA speaker. And I have been going to meetings since 2002 with Tim. His home group for many years joked that I had better attendance than many of the home group members because I was there most Thursday nights. So I'm just going to start off a little bit about my story and not really go into my life with Tim, just to kind of set things from where I grew up at. I was number 4 of 5 children. I was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where Tim was born. My parents had 5 kids in 5 years, so it was a very stressful home for them. My father was a Pittsburgh fireman. My mother was a stay-at-home mom, and drinking was a part of everything in my life growing up. We were an Irish Catholic family who lived 2 miles within every family member, and alcohol was involved in every celebration, everything that we did as a family. From a really young age, alcohol was something that I was very aware of, and it was something that I was very much against. Because of the behaviors of my parents along the years, they weren't a couple that drank every night, but when they drank, there was fights, there were just things that happened as I got older, and I realized, many years later that was their coping mechanism, and that's all they knew, and they did what they could do, and it is what it is. But I had a lot of resentment and just a lot of things growing up. I met Tim when I was 19 years old. My cousin, who was also in this family of drinking, and he also drank and partied, he introduced me to Tim as a blind date. If any of you are from Pennsylvania or that area, there's an amusement park called Kennywood Park. And their little theme is fall in love down in Kennywood Park. And I did. We went on this blind date at 19 years old, and we've been together ever since, which is 39 years now. When I first met Tim, one of the things I noticed that he wasn't drinking. He was smoking, but he was not drinking. Any party we went to, he'd hold that beer all night, but he was doing other things. And I had thought to myself from a really early age, I did not want to be involved with someone that drank because I saw the effects of alcohol. I just, I didn't want to label my parents alcoholics at the time. Since years have gone by and my siblings and I have all grown up, I would question my siblings. This was an alcoholic home, right? They'd be like, yeah, it was an alcoholic home. I'm like, okay, I wasn't crazy. There was too much drinking in that home. But Tim wasn't drinking at the time when I met him at 19. And at the age of 21, we got married. And Tim usually tells this part in his story, but he was a senior in college, and I was having our second baby. And we had no money, and we were living in this horrible house with squirrels in the ceiling and sometimes didn't have money for milk and bread, but there was always money for stuff to smoke. And it was this cycle that I was seeing what had happened in my past. At one point, we were 28 years old. Things had just continued to where that cycle had just not really changed. I always worked an evening or night shift, so I was giving up sleep to stay home with the kids in the daytime, and Tim had his Monday through Friday 9 to 5 kind of job. But, it kind of fell on me to be the caregiver of, our children and to make sure that, we couldn't afford daycare, so I had to work an opposite shift of him, and it was just this whole life of, now I look back, I have no regrets, but at the time, it was hard. It was not an easy thing to go through. 28 years old, we moved to North Carolina. My brother had lived here in North Carolina, and he used to send Tim the want ads. Yes, we had newspapers with want ads back in the day. And he used to send the want ads to Tim, and Tim had found a job here in North Carolina, and I know it was one of those things in AA as a geographical cure, but Tim didn't know anyone here to get his supplies from, so we were off to a good start. We lived in Cary, North Carolina for the first year, but within the first month of moving into the place we moved into, we quickly realized the people all around us were from either Pennsylvania or Ohio, and they were all drinking all the time. So Tim kind of fell right into the drinking part of things. It didn't take long for him to switch to then start drinking alcohol. I knew from a really long time ago that something was going to have to change, and I didn't know how that was going to change in the sense of what I could do about it. I didn't go to college. Tim did. I stayed home with the kids for a really short time when we first moved to North Carolina, but other than that, I was back to working from 6 in the evening till 2 in the morning or a night shift. For 20 years, I was an emergency room secretary. I always thought maybe someday I'd go to nursing school, but at the time, with 2 kids and everything else in my life, it was like, this is just going to be what it is. But I knew deep down in my heart that I could not raise 2 kids on the salary that I was making, and that at some point, Tim and I together may not be how it ends up. It was a hard reality to face. It was fear-driven on my part to not go to college early on, but at some point at 40 years old, I decided this is what I need to do. I was in nursing school when Tim went into recovery, and I had literally just done a clinical setting at Holly Hill, which many of you might not be aware, but at the time was a drug and alcohol rehab center in Raleigh. I had done my rotation there, and within a few months after me finishing that set of clinicals, Tim was in Holly Hill as a patient. I was trying to hide that from everyone. Our family was all up in Pennsylvania, so nobody really ever knew how bad things had gotten for us. But it was also one of those things deep down in my heart. I've always known that Tim's my soulmate, and I was never ready to give up on our marriage, and I was never ready to walk away from anything. I just didn't know what else to do. Getting back to the time that I was really, really young, I learned in my family that we each had this role to play and how we fit in. And mine as the 4th child, my role was to be the one that spoke up. So if I wanted anything or got anything that I needed, I had to speak up and get it. So I literally had the nickname Mighty Mouth when I was young because I was the one that was just going to speak up and be assertive and get what I needed. But all these years with Tim, over time, I did that on some levels of my life, but other sides of my life, I just didn't speak up because I knew that I couldn't control what was going on. And that word control really has been one of my biggest things my entire life. I can control it. I can fix it. I can make it better. And at some point during his drinking and the alcoholism over the years, I became aware that I cannot control this. I have absolutely no way to control this. So in, I'm trying to remember what year it was, 2012, I was a nurse. I was, Tim had already gone through, like he said, his relapse was in 2011. In 2012, I had decided that it was time for me to do something for me in my life. I had been going to AA meetings for a really long time, and I learned about AA. I didn't go to Al-Anon meetings out of fear. I had done an Al-Anon meeting or 2 in 2002. And my impression was it was a bunch of people in a room complaining about their alcoholics, and why would I go back? I just wouldn't need to go back. I'm getting what I need in AA. I'm learning about AA. I have never gone to an AA meeting, just trying to make sure that Tim went to his meeting. The first meeting I went with Tim because I was curious and I needed to know how they were controlling this and fixing this when I couldn't. I didn't understand that. I didn't understand how this group of Alcoholics Anonymous could be given him what he needed. And my thought process, I could go this way where I'm like negative. I've actually known a lot of women over the years who get really jealous of AA and have even divorced their spouses over AA because their spouses do an AA all the time. And so I knew from early on I needed to jump in and learn as much as I could about Alcoholics Anonymous. And I'm so grateful that I did. I have been, and you talk about a sick, twisted brain that I have. I have been going to AA meetings since 2002, and I'm not an alcoholic. Just think about that for a second. So a lot of times, in AA and people with an AA program, like, I don't really understand Al-Anon. I don't really get what it is you need to fix. And for the years from 2002 until like 2012, I really thought my alcoholics are sober. I don't have to control that anymore. AA has done that for me. I can just kind of coast and go through my life and do what I need to do. I was working for several years as a hospice nurse. After I was done nursing school, I worked in the burn center a couple years, and then I was doing hospice for several years. And so I've seen a lot in my career. Seen a lot of alcoholic families, seen a lot of alcoholism in my work environment of going into families' homes at the end of life. And me as the nurse realizing this family has a lot of issues and a lot of unresolved things. And so I've seen a lot of different angles from this. But the one angle that I never worked on was me. The reason I keep bringing up 2012, in 2012 I decided I wanted to start doing something to physically feel better in my life. I had gotten heavy. I was just in this mode of like not doing anything for myself. So my son had been running at the time. We'd gone to a couple 5Ks to watch him run, and we went to one of his races, and I was like, I can do this. I can do the couch to 5K, and I can start running, and I can be healthy. What's wrong with me? Like, I need to start taking care of myself. It's just time. My kids are, grown and gone, and it's just time for me, which is what Al-Anon's about, too. But at this time, I started doing this where I was getting out, I was making some friends, I was doing some social things, I was becoming physically better. Still wasn't working on my spiritual side of anything. And 2014, the control issue came in big time. I had just finished my second half marathon. I was so like, okay, this is like so awesome. A week later, I was diagnosed with cancer. And that cancer diagnosis sent me into a tailspin of lack of control and just my whole spiritual being that was beyond anything I could have imagined. I dealt with death every single day as my job. And here I was being faced with this diagnosis, and I didn't know what was going to happen. All I knew was I was really sick, and it happened really fast, and within 2 days of the diagnosis, I was having surgery, and then I was going through daily radiation for 6 weeks. And my world flipped upside down. And I always knew I didn't have the control of the alcoholics in my life. But those alcoholics in my life saved my life because they both, Tim and Lauren, my daughter, recognized that I was in really bad shape mentally and spiritually. And Tim literally organized and got it set up for me to go see a therapist. And against my better judgment at the time, because I didn't really want to have to work on me, and I knew even with the therapist I was going to have to work on me, I went and saw a therapist. I was in her office for about 15 or 20 minutes of that 1 hour visit, and she was already saying to me, have you ever thought about Al-Anon? And I was like, I'm here because I had cancer and I can't deal with any of the control and what is going to happen with me. And she was like, this goes way back. This is something that you've not had in your life as far as your own higher power. I grew up in a home that we were Catholic, and Tim always talks about how he had a loving God. I did not have a loving God from as far back as I can remember. The crucifix on the wall in Mass meant to me that that higher power knows everything that I think, and I'm a horrible person. I'm such a horrible person because I have thoughts sometimes that aren't healthy, or just negative thoughts about people, or just being whatever. But I never felt like I had a loving higher power. My whole life, I just never could understand that concept of a higher power. And I had watched Tim and Lauren working their spiritual programs and seeing them change, watching how they changed in AA. But I had never done anything for me to work the steps or to do anything to get down to the core of what was going on with me and finding my own higher power. And the reason I brought up, with the running portion of things, because I had gotten to this point where I knew something was wrong. No one else was telling me at the time. But I was trying to fix physical things or doing whatever just to get to that healthy place. Lurking notion is something that's been brought up many, many times in meetings that I have listened to. And I know Tim brings it up in his speech. But I had a lurking notion from the time I was really, really young. And it sounds crazy coming from somebody that's not an alcoholic. And I should have been an alcoholic when I look at the history of everything. It's like, how did I not become an alcoholic? My lurking notion was that because my entire life I have been controlling everyone's behaviors or trying to fix my parents and how they were perceived outside the house, and Tim's behavior and my kids' behaviors. And even at work, I was the go-to person in any job I've ever had. This was a pattern. Go to Marcy, she'll get the management to fix it. And you better believe I would have. I'm the kind of person, my mouth is up there telling management how to run the place. And a lot of times that worked for me. But over time, I became sicker and sicker and sicker. And that lurking notion in me and the sickness of the disease of alcoholism in me, just being surrounded by it and always trying to fix everyone else, I didn't know where I stopped and you started. I just had no idea that there was a line that I crossed, and I crossed it many years ago. And my lurking notion was that someday I'm going to get sick. And I'm going to get sick because of my behaviors. I think that's really sick too in your head, to think that. And so when that cancer diagnosis came, for everybody else it was shock. And for me it was this aha moment that I knew this was going to happen. It was this lurking notion that my higher power at some point was going to show me that you were doing wrong. I found Al-Anon in the midst of all that. I don't think that way today. I absolutely feel like I have a higher power. Tim and I have been praying all these years together and doing things that I thought I was supposed to be doing. But deep down in my core, I still had this mindset of like, I'm still not a good person. I've always done things in my mind out of trying to be helpful to others. But sometimes in my heart, it was like, yeah, maybe you're just not a good person and you're just trying to be conniving, or maybe you're just trying to get what you want because you're selfish. I had these battles, no different than probably a lot of you that are in AA. But when I got sick and I basically got my little ticket into Al-Anon, which for many years, I had been to an AA Al-Anon convention in San Antonio, Texas, with 70,000 AA and Al-Anoners. I wasn't in the program because I didn't need it. I was fine. I wasn't fine. I was very sick and had very twisted thinking. I had obsessive thoughts from the time I could remember about when somebody comes home and how much they drink and how I can control what it is they were doing. And it was just this whole thing that came crashing down when I realized that not only do I not have control of my alcoholics, but I don't have control over my destination of anything else, because my higher power has this. And I needed to stop playing the higher power and let my higher power do what he needed to do, and I call my higher power God. Getting into Al-Anon, we have a large group that I meet with, and there's a lot of recovery in that meeting. And for the first few weeks, I sat and listened, and then I knew enough about going to AA meetings that I needed a service position. I needed to work the steps. I needed to get a sponsor. I knew what I needed to do. My first few months in Al-Anon, I was so exhausted and reaching out for help and so scared that my therapist had actually recommended jumping into the steps right away. And I was like, I don't have a sponsor. She's like, you could talk to your husband. Came home, I said, Tim, I know this sounds crazy. I don't have real secrets from you on any level, and when I get to the fifth step, the therapist will listen to it. Will you work the steps with me? Tim and I worked the steps. I had already worked the steps several years back. Tim, and the reason I mentioned Jerry early on, Jerry and his wife Sarah have been a big part of our lives in early recovery and just kind of helping us along the way. Really early on in Tim's recovery, we did a big book study with the four of us, and Sarah was not in Al-Anon and I was not in Al-Anon, but the four of us got together every Sunday morning for an entire year and read at each other's houses, just going through the big book. And when we got through the steps, Sarah and I did them together, and Tim and Jerry did it together. So I had been through the steps on that level. But coming around this time and working them with Tim, I kind of got the same thing that Tim did. So I did the steps with Tim within my first 6 or 7 months going to Al-Anon. And then I got a sponsor in Al-Anon, and we did the steps together. And now I have the absolute grace to be able to listen to other women and work with them in the Al-Anon program. It's been an incredible road, because if I would have known in the beginning, all those years back when I would question about what Tim was doing and where it could lead us, and I had so much fear and so much doubt, Al-Anon wouldn't have helped me any earlier, I don't think, because I just wasn't ready to go. When I got to my breaking point, I was right where I needed to be, and I knew enough about AA and Al-Anon to be able to get in there and give it my all and not just be, halfway with it. So I just, wanted to share with all of you how the program of Alcoholics Anonymous is no different than the program of Al-Anon. In the sense, we work the same steps, same traditions, we do sponsors, we have speaker meetings, we do the whole process. Our minds are, at least for me, as twisted or more than my alcoholics, because I put up with it. I let it happen. I didn't say at any given point, here's my boundary and you're not going to cross it. I didn't have boundaries. I didn't know what a boundary was. I didn't know how to detach to somebody and just to be able to say, I can't handle that behavior. I would just be sucked right in. One of the really cool things with Al-Anon is when we go to meetings now, our daughter is in Wilmington, and I'm so very proud of not only the work she's done in AA, because she is also a member of Al-Anon. In her career choice, she went on and got her master's, and she works with people in recovery for her job. I mean, who would have thought that when, this 19-year-old girl came crawling into my bed one night crying and saying, I need help. And that's where that path led her. And watching Tim over the years in his jobs and different things that I've watched him grow. And it's really cool when my own children have said to me, and they're both in their 30s now, but how they see such a difference in me. And I wouldn't be able to tell you there's a big difference on the outside. I know inside there's a big difference, but they've evidently seen it on the outside. And I think that that's really been a cool thing for me to realize and recognize. We have a grandbaby now that's almost 2. And knowing that, we can be a help in lives as we continue on in our generations of our family, knowing that, my daughter kind of jokes about it, but she's like, hopefully the buck stops here with her, that she knows enough now to not, have this disease spread on through further generations, because it's been going on for so many years in my lifetime. But I just think that, my twisted thinking and my ways of feeling that down to my core have just changed drastically, and it is truly by working with my sponsor and working the steps and just believing that my higher power really is a higher power. And that was something I didn't have before I came into Al-Anon. Even all those years of AA meetings, I didn't really have it. I do now, and I'm very grateful. Thanks for letting me share.